soldiers together and then started talking obsessively about his travels. Butler kept waiting for him to get to the point, but then he picked up right again on those anecdotes. In France, McGuire had met with members of the far-right paramilitary group La Croix de Feu, the Cross of Fire. In Italy, he had studied the structure of Mussolini's government and been enamored with the loyalty and power of Il Duce's black shirts. He had also met with representatives of the new German government and admired their ambitions. And fascism was a relatively popular thing at the time in America because it really hadn't been shown to be so devastating in post-Hitler era. And a lot of people were like, hey, we kind of need a strong leader right now to help us get out of this crap. He'd also met with representatives, again, of this new German government, and he thought that the time was right to try the same thing in America. This is really his final ambition. He's come to a point where enough with all this pussyfooting around the issue here. We're going to get to it. We want to make America a fascist state. A new Secretary of General Affairs, the one who would replace the Secretary of State and leave the president to dedicate bridges and kiss children. That's who they really needed. That's who they wanted to change at the time, and really one of the major people in charge. For the first time, Butler understood what McGuire wanted. McGuire and his group wanted Smedley Butler to become America's first fascist dictator, propped up by devoted following of veterans who, of course, would all be paid those bonuses and that fabulous non-rubber money, but real golden, powerful gold-backed standard, baby. That's what he wanted him to do. This was the request, to overthrow a man who he had publicly backed and supported against the disastrous policies of Herbert Hoover, but much more broadly and more importantly, overthrow American democracy as a whole. Some of the members of his organization, McGuire said, had wanted Douglas MacArthur to lead the revolution, but he known since the breakup with the Bonus Army that MacArthur would never be as esteemed as Smedley Butler would be to the veterans. McGuire estimated that in all, they'd only need an army of about 500,000. The general asked how they intended to pull all this off, or even pay for it. McGuire, money is no object with these people. McGuire explained the group would be announcing its presence publicly in the next few weeks. He wasn't sure which name they'd settled on yet, but between the collaborators, they might have as much as $300 million to commit to protecting the Constitution. Again, all this stuff about maybe respecting the will of the people to pick the president in the current situation, that stuff was not, I mean, that stuff, I seem to remember in the Constitution, right? I mean, maybe I'm not sure, I don't know. Yeah, but that didn't matter to these people had really, for the longest time, believed themselves to be kind of on top of everything, and really beyond reproach. These were people who, more than anything, thought that the world was theirs and belonged to them. And they, for the first time, actually had their power threatened in what seemed to be a new era of equality and egalitarianism that people like FDR, the class traitor, would want to try and maybe successfully bring about. So it was a really significant move. And by the way, $300 million there, that's more than $5 billion in 2019 currency. So it was quite a commitment there. Whether Butler agreed or not, McGuire said once they got in touch with the right members of the American Legion and veterans of foreign wars and required weaponry, it was only a matter of time until their plot was successful. Once again, he still persisted here. Because Butler was so esteemed, he still persisted and really wanted Butler for this job. This time, Butler couldn't stop thinking about it. Mussolini had strangely proved popular in America over the last decade. The press was similarly hopeful about Hitler at the time. It seems crazy to say, but it's true. I mean, it's not like the press were like responsible, challenging of fascism. No, a lot of these press outlets were also owned by the same people that Butler was interacting with. Some of the most powerful, wealthy people in the world at this time. Like people like it's literally true that the New York Times around this time gave Hitler, or Time Magazine, I believe, gave Hitler Person of the Year back at that time. In July, Fortune magazine had run an editorial which asked whether fascism is achieving in a few years or decades, a few years of decades, such a conquest of the spirit of man as Christianity achieved only in 10 centuries. So, like, fascism on the rise. That's what they're saying. It's the hot new trendy thing. The article went on, the good journalist must recognize in fascism certainly ancient virtues of the race, whether or not they happen to be momentarily fashionable in his own countries. I mean, in a lot of this here, you're talking about, they're viewing this through the context of the race, the white race. Like, that's what they're about. Among these are discipline, duty, courage, glory, sacrifice. Butler decided to call a friend at the VFW and warn him about what he'd been hearing. As it turned out, there were other similar rumors floating around. Without proof, the conspiracy was not necessarily anything more than just a rumor, and it was almost getting time for the conspirators to make their move. When the American Liberty League, a group of conservatives, opposed FDR and his New Deal became public, any notion that it was merely a rumor simply just vanished, because it clearly wasn't. There were people out there saying they didn't like FDR. Among its members, all people you've heard before, Colonel M.P. Murphy, Robert S. Clark, and John W. Davis. Every one of the conspirators McGuire had mentioned. There are other connections too. The members list of the American Liberty League was a who's who of business and politics insiders, including members of both political parties opposed to the New Deal. And of course, its stated purpose was protect the Constitution. Of course. Butler realized something else then about himself. Part of why he'd been the perfect candidate was that he was known for his temper and speaking out. If he went public with his accusations, people might think it was a publicity stunt. He needed more than just his own word to inform the government. So he reached out to a journalist from the Philadelphia Record, Paul French, who helped him collect evidence. French determined that all is the American Liberty League member Irene DuPont, who would later do business with the Nazis well into World War II, owned a controlling stake in Remington Colt, which possibly provided the group with access to the artillery. Other members of all included Al Smith, former governor of New York and 1932 Democratic presidential hopeful turned rival of President Roosevelt, because Roosevelt crushed him, as well as other men whose connections ran back to the Ku Klux Klan and pro-Nazi groups within the United States. These were some of the most powerful, most right-wing people in the country, and they were intent on overthrowing the will of the people. As the New York Post put it, the brood of anti-New Deal organizations spawned by the Liberty League are in turn spawning fascism. To build more evidence, Butler introduced French to McGuire as a like-minded friend. Soon McGuire opened up to the reporter as well, in some cases being even more candid with the French than he had been with the general. According to French's account, McGuire was convinced that we need a fascist government in this country to save the nation from the communists who want to tear down and wreck all that we have built. And when they talk about we, they don't talk about everybody. The only men who have the patriotism to do it are the soldiers, and Smedley Butler is the ideal leader. As French recalled, McGuire continually discussed a dictator who would become galloping in on his white horse, either through the threat of armed forces or the delegation of power and the use of a group of organized veterans to save the capitalistic system. And it was around that time that French and Butler were building a case against McGuire, who and his purported co-conspirators, that the general was subpoenaed to discuss rumors of a fascist plot before the Special Committee on Un-American Activities. After Butler and French had testified, Gerald McGuire was allowed to speak in his own defense. For his part, McGuire claimed that Butler and French had made it all up. He had traveled to Europe for his pleasure and certainly never tried to buy Butler's compliance for a coup, even though it was all out there in the open. Despite this, when the letters which contained McGuire discussing quad-a-few training movements and his plans were produced, he had no explanation for why he so closely described a far-right paramilitary veterans group and was gushing about it. Similarly, he had no explanation for the $20,000 that went missing from his accounts during the same time frame Butler claimed he had been offered 18 $1,000 bills, of course, that we told you about earlier. In the end, McGuire only spoke to the committee. Robert S. Clark lived in France. It cannot be forced to appear in the United States, but no explanation were provided for the absence of Colonel Murphy, John Davis, or any other suspected conspirators. They were never asked to testify at all. So, and this is, again, really the power that the government can give you, which is probably one of the most, and being so associated with the government can give you. It can really allow you to get away with attempting to overthrow democracy. So when the court report was published, it concluded that a plot to overthrow the Roosevelt administration and install a fascist government in its place did indeed exist. How far it had gotten was never determined, however, and the investigations into the plot never officially looked into that anyway. Names of the accused and the American Liberty League itself were redacted in this official report. An incredible display of the powerful protecting the powerful in what really we would all kind of come to know as the future of American politics. Something that I'm sure many people can draw deep parallels in what we see in today's news. But just think about the implications of the plot there at this point, and what would happen maybe if there were slightly different people doing it, maybe with different political motivations from a different perspective, and what the reaction might have been, and maybe if they weren't some of those powerful, richest people in the country. So here's a newsreel from the time about General Butler bearing this plot against fascists from Universal Newsreel.
I appeared before the Congressional Committee, the highest representation of the American people, under subpoena to tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship. The plan as outlined to me was to form an organization of veterans, to use as a bluff or as a club at least, to intimidate the government and break down our democratic institutions. The upshot of the whole thing was that I was supposed to lead an organization of 500,000 men, which would be able to take over the functions of government. I talked with an investigator for this committee who came to me with a subpoena on Sunday, November 18th. He told me they had unearthed evidence linking my name with several such veteran organizations. As it then seemed to me to be getting serious, I felt it was my duty to tell all I knew of such activities to this committee. My main interest in all this is to preserve our democratic institutions. I want to retain the right to vote, the right to speak freely, and the right to write. If we maintain these basic principles, our democracy is safe. No dictatorship can exist with suffrage, freedom of speech, and press.
Makes a good point there, several. On March 25th, 1935, however, another shoe dropped. Joe McGuire suddenly died of pneumonia at 37, and his family publicly blamed the stress of Butler's accusations for ending his life. Regardless of the reasons, with McGuire gone, a key witness. I mean, honestly, this is really drawing. I can't help but think of Jeffrey Epstein's case about this. Like, killed under the most suspicious circumstances, with some of the most powerful people implicated in what is just an absolutely astoundingly horrible crime. It's completely covered up. All possible hints and ties are washed away like that. And what do we get? Nothing. People dying of strange reasons that are really, really dubious once any scrutiny is applied to them, and all of a sudden, the case just dies. And it's just like that. So, newspaper headline, Gerald McGuire, accused by General Butler in fascist plot, dies. Brother blames shock of congressional probe for death. So that is the tact they took. And that was in the Iowa Dispatch coverage of McGuire's sudden death in March 1935. So who knows what could have been? What was the real story behind that? I mean, but the reality of the situation is these people really did try and aim to and did come in some way. They certainly had the capabilities, to say, to overthrow the president of the United States. Nobody talks about it. Nobody's investigated it. And the people at the time did everything they could to sweep it under the rug. Just really, regardless of your political affiliations or whatever you might think of FDR at that time or anything I'm telling you right now, it is quite a remarkable thing that so few people actually know about this. Butler then went on to publish his book, War is a Racket, later that same year. As an anti-war classic, throughout the text, Butler laments the military roles in places like Nicaragua, Mexico, and China. I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street, for the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. Butler spent the rest of his life trying to draw attention to the